Metro 2033, Dmitry Glukhovsky, Chapter 19, The Final Battle. Having moved the heavy cast-iron lid of the closed manhole aside, they began their descent. The narrow vertical shaft was composed of concrete rings, from each of which jutted a metal bracket. As soon as they were left alone, Ullman changed. He spoke to Artyom in short monosyllabic phrases, mainly giving orders or admonishing him. As soon as the lid of the hatch had been removed, he ordered Artyom to put out the flashlight and, putting on the night vision instrument, dived inside first. Artyom had to crawl down, holding onto the brackets. He didn't really understand what all these precautions were for, as, after the Kremlin, they hadn't encountered any danger along their way. Finally, Artyom decided that the stalker had given Ullman special instructions, and having been left without a commander, he was enthusiastically filling the role himself. Ullman smacked Artyom on the foot, giving the sign to stop. Artyom obediently froze, waiting until the other man explained to him what was happening. But instead of explanations, a soft thump was heard from below. It was Ullman jumping to the floor. A few seconds later, Artyom heard muffled gunshots. "You can come down," his partner said to Artyom in a loud whisper, and a light came on. When the brackets ended, he released his hands and dropped about 2 meters, landing on a cement floor. Lifting himself up, he dusted off his hands and looked around. They were in a short corridor, about 15 paces long. The opening of the manhole yawned above them in the ceiling. There was another hatch just like it in the floor, with the very same cast-iron grooved cover. Beside it, in a pool of blood, lay a dead, savage face downwards, squeezing his blowpipe tight in his hand even after death. He was guarding the passage. Ullman replied quietly at Artyom's questioning glance, but he had fallen asleep. Most likely he didn't expect anyone to crawl in from this side. He had put his ear to the hatch and dropped off. "You killed him." "What, while he was sleeping?" Artyom asked. "So what? It wasn't a fair fight." Ullman sniffed. If nothing else, now he'll know not to sleep on duty. Anyway, he was a bad person. He wasn't observing their holy day. He was told not to go into the tunnels. Dragging the body to the side, Ullman opened the hatch and again put out his flashlight. This time the shaft was extremely short and led to an office filled with trash. A mountain of metal plates, gears, springs, and nickel-plated handrails, enough parts for a whole coach, completely hid the manhole from prying eyes. They were heaped on top of each other in disarray, right up to the ceiling, and stayed there only by some kind of miracle. There was a narrow passage between this pile and the wall, but getting through it without touching and bringing a whole mountain of metal down was almost impossible. A door buried in dirt up to its middle led from the office to an unusual square tunnel. A line from the left there. Either there was an obstruction, or they had stopped laying the track for some reason. To the right there was a standard tunnel, round and wide. It seemed as if there was a border between two intertwined subterranean worlds here. Even breathing was different. The air was damp, but not so ghastly and stagnant as in the secret D6 passages. They weren't sure where to go. They decided not to move out at random, as there was a frontier post of the Fourth Reich located on this line. Judging by the map, it was only about 20 minutes from Mayakovskaya to Tchaikovskaya. Digging into the bag with his things, Artyom found the bloodied map he had got from Daniel and worked out the true direction from it. Less than 5 minutes later, they reached Mayakovskaya. Sitting down on a bench, Ullman took the heavy helmet off his head with a sigh of relief, wiped his red, damp face with a sleeve, and ran his fingers through his dark blonde crew cut. Despite his powerful frame and having the habits of an old tunnel wolf, Ullman, it seemed, was only slightly older than Artyom. While they were looking for somewhere to buy food, Artyom was able to inspect the station. He no longer knew how much time had passed since his last meal, but his aching stomach was no laughing matter. Ullman had no supplies on him. They had left in a hurry and brought only what was necessary. Mayakovskaya resembled Kievskaya. It was just a shadow of the once elegant and airy station. In this half of the ruined station, people huddled in ragged tents or out on the platform. The walls and ceiling were covered with damp patches and trickling water. There was one small campfire for the whole station, but no fuel. The inhabitants talked among themselves quietly, as if at the bedside of a dying man. However, there was a shop even here, a patched-up three-man tent with a folding table displayed at the entrance. The selection was modest. Skinned rat carcasses, dried up and shrunken mushrooms, procured here God knows when, and even uncut squares of moss. A price tag lay proudly next to each item, a piece of newsprint with carefully handwritten numbers. There were almost no shoppers except them, only an undernourished, stooped woman holding a small boy by the hand. The child was pulling towards a rat lying on the counter, but his mother admonished him, "Don't touch! We've already eaten meat this week!" The boy obeyed, but he didn't forget about the carcass for long. As soon as the mother turned away, he once more tried to reach for the dead animal. "Kolka! What did I tell you? If you are bad, the demons will come out of the tunnels to get you. Sashka didn't obey his mommy, and they took him." The woman scolded him, succeeding at the last moment to pull him away from the counter. Artyom and Ulman couldn't make up their minds. Artyom began to think that he could survive until they got to Prospect Mir, where the mushrooms would at least be fresher. Some rat, perhaps. "We fry them in front of the customer," the shop's bald owner said with some dignity. "Certificate of quality," he added enigmatically. "Thanks, I've already eaten." Ulman hastened to turn him down. "Artyom, what do you want? I wouldn't take the moss. World War IV will start in your gut from it." The woman looked at him with disapproval. In her hand were only 2 cartridges, which, judging by the prices, was just enough for the moss. Noting that Artyom was looking at her modest capital, the woman hid her fist behind her back. "Nothing here," she snarled, spitefully. "If you don't intend to buy anything, get lost. We're not all millionaires. What are you staring at?" Artyom wanted to answer, but he was carried away by the sight of her son. The boy was very similar to Oleg. He had the same colorless, fragile hair, reddish eyes, and turned-up nose. The boy put his thumb in his mouth and smiled shyly at Artyom, looking at him a bit sullenly. Artyom felt as if his lips were spreading into a smile in spite of himself, and his eyes were swelling with tears. The woman intercepted his glance and flew into a rage. "Damned perverts!" she screeched, her eyes glaring. "Let's go home, Kolyenka!" She pulled the boy by the hand. "Wait, stop for a minute." Artyom pressed several shells out of the reserve clip of his machine gun, and catching up to the woman, gave them to her. "Here, these are for you, for your Kolya." She looked at him with distrust, then her mouth twisted scornfully. "Just what do you think you can get for 5 cartridges? That he'll be your child?" Artyom didn't immediately understand what she had in mind. Finally it came to him, and he was on the verge of opening his mouth to start making excuses, but he wasn't able to utter a thing, and he just stood there, staring blankly. The woman, satisfied with the effect she had produced, replaced her rage with mercy. "Agreed, certainly. 20 cartridges for half an hour." Stunned, Artyom shook his head, turned, and nearly took off running. "Jerk! Okay, give me 15!" the woman cried after him. Ulman was still standing there, discussing something with the seller. "Well, what about the rats? Haven't you made up your mind?" The owner of the tent inquired courteously, having seen the returning Artyom. "A little bit more, and she'll start bargaining with me." Artyom understood. Pulling Ulman behind him, he hurried from this godforsaken station. "Where are we going in such a hurry?" the fighter asked when they were walking through the tunnel in the direction of Belaruskaya. While trying to cope with the lump rising in his throat, Artyom told him what had happened. His story did not especially impress Ulman. "So what? She has to live somehow," he responded. "Why is such a life necessary at all?" Artyom's face convulsed. "Do you have any ideas?" Ulman shrugged his broad shoulders. "What's the sense of such a life? You cling to it, you endure all this filth, humiliation, you trade your children, stuff your face with moss for what?" Artyom stopped short, recalling Hunter, who had been talking about the survival instinct, about the fact that one would fight like a wild animal for his life and the survival of others with all his might. Then, at the very beginning, his words had inflamed a hope and desire in Artyom to fight like that frog who had whipped the cream in the jar with its feet, turning it into butter. But now the words uttered by his stepfather for some reason seemed more reliable. "And for what?" Ulman teased him. Well, all right, young man, for what are you living? Artyom regretted that he had got involved in this conversation. As a fighter, he had to give Ullman his due. He was superb. But as a companion, he wasn't especially interesting. And Artyom could see it was useless to argue with him regarding the sense of life. Well, personally, I am for what? He answered sullenly, not able to bear it. Well, for what? Ullman began to laugh. For the rescue of mankind? Leave it! It's all nonsense. You aren't saving it, so it's someone else. Me, for example. He shined the flashlight on his face so that Artyom could see him and made a heroic face. Artyom looked at him jealously but said nothing. And then, the fighter continued, they all just cannot live for it. And what about you? Is life without meaning? Artyom tried to ask the question ironically. How is it without meaning? It makes sense for me, the same way as for everyone. And generally, searches for the meaning of life usually happen during puberty. But for you, it seems it's taken longer. His tone was not offensive, but mischievous, so that Artyom wouldn't sulk. Inspired by his success, Ullman continued, I remember when I was 17. I was trying to understand it all, too. It passes. There is only one meaning in life, brother, to make and bring up children. But let them be tormented by the question, and answer it how they can. Well, that's the theory, he smiled again. And then just why are you coming with me? Are you risking your life? If you don't believe in rescuing mankind, then what? Artyom asked after some time. First, I was ordered to, Ullman said severely. Orders are not questioned. Second, it's not enough to make children, you have to raise them. And how will I grow them if your riffraff from VDNKh eat them up? Such self-confidence exuded from him, his strength and his words, that the picture of the world was so seductively simple and organized that Artyom no longer wanted to argue with him. On the other hand, he felt that the fighter was inspiring a confidence in him too. As Melnik had said, the tunnel between Mayakovskaya and Belaruskaya turned out to be peaceful. True, something was banging in the ventilation shafts, but they slipped past normal-sized rats a few times, and that reassured Artyom. The section was surprisingly short. They had not even been able to complete the argument when the lights of the station appeared ahead. Being close to Hansa had a profound influence on Belaruskaya. It was immediately apparent that it was rather well protected. A blockhouse had been constructed 10 meters before the entrance. A light machine gun stood on sacks filled with dirt, and the guard detail consisted of 5 men. Checking their documents, and here the new passport came in handy, they asked them politely whether they were from the Reich. No, they assured Artyom, no one here has anything against the Reich. It was a trading station, observed full neutrality, and did not interfere in the conflicts between the powers, as the chief of the guard called Hansa, the Reich, and the Red Line. Before continuing their trip along the ring, Artyom and Ullman decided they could take a break and have a bite. Sitting in an affluent, even chic snack bar, Artyom obtained information about Belaruskaya, as well as eating an excellent and inexpensive cutlet. A round-faced, fair-haired man sitting at the table opposite, who introduced himself as Leonid Petrovich, was tucking away an epic portion of bacon and eggs, and when his mouth was empty, he told them with pleasure about his station. Belaruskaya survived because of the transit of pork and chicken. Huge and very successful enterprises were located beyond the ring, closer to Sukhoi and even to Voikovskaya, though the latter was dangerously close to the surface. Kilometers of tunnels and engineering lines had been converted to a huge livestock farm that fed all of Hansa and delivered goods both to the Fourth Reich and to the eternally half-starved Red Line. Moreover, the residents of Dynamo had inherited from their enterprising predecessors an aptitude for the tailor's trade. They sewed the pigskin jackets that Artyom had seen at Prospect Mir. No external danger from this end of the Zamoskvoretskaya line existed, and in all the years of living in the metro, no one even once had put either Sukhoi, Airport, or Dynam out of business. Hansa laid no claims to them, being satisfied by the ability to collect a duty from the transportation of the goods, and at the same time they rendered them protection from the fascists and the Reds. Nearly all of the residents of Belaruskaya were involved in business. Farmers from Sukhoi and tailors from Dynamo had the sense to make a profit from the wholesale deliveries. Bringing a batch of hogs or live chickens on handcars and trams pulled by men, the people from that side, as they called them here, unloaded their belongings. For these purposes, special cranes even had been installed on the platforms, settled up their accounts, and left for home. Life bustled at the station. The resolute traders, at Byeloruskaya they were called managers for some reason, drifted from the terminal, the unloading locations, to warehouses, jingling bags with cartridges and dispensing instructions to sinewy loaders. Small carts on well-lubricated wheels, laden with boxes and bundles, rolled noiselessly towards rows of counters, or to the ring boundary line from where Hansa buyers took the merchandise, or to the opposite edge of the platform, where Reich emissaries awaited the unloading of their orders. There were quite a few fascists here, but not the ordinary ones, mainly officers. However, they behaved themselves. They were a little arrogant, but within the bounds of decency. They looked with hostility at the swarthy, dark-haired men, of whom there were enough among the local tradesmen and loaders. But they didn't try to impose their beliefs and laws. And we have banks here too, you know. Many of them from the Reich come to us supposedly for goods, but really they come to invest their savings. His companion shared with Artyom. I doubt that they will touch us. We are like Switzerland for them, he added incomprehensibly. You have it good here, Artyom noted politely. It's not just us. It's all about Byeloruskaya. So where are you from? Leonid Petrovich finally asked out of respect. Ullman pretended that all his attention was on his cutlet, and he had not heard the question. I'm from VDNKh, Artyom replied, glancing at him. What do you say? How terrible! Leonid Petrovich even put down his knife and fork. They say things are really bad there? I heard they are hanging on by a thread. Half the people have died. Is it true? A lump stuck in Artyom's throat. For better or for worse, he had to reach VDNKh, see his own kind, perhaps, for the last time. How had he been able to waste valuable time eating? Moving the plate away, he asked for the bill, and, despite Ullman's protests, pulled him along with him, past the counters with meat and clothing in the openings of the arches, past the piles of merchandise, past the bartering peddlers, bustling loaders, the sedately strolling fascist officers, towards the crossing to the ring line. Over the entrance hung a white cloth with a brown circle in the middle. Two machine gunners in the familiar gray camouflage checked their documents and inspected their things. Artyom had not succeeded in getting through to the Hansa territory with such ease before. Ullman, still chewing a piece of cutlet, dug into his pocket and presented an unknown type of ID to the border guards. They silently moved away a section of the barrier, allowing them in. What kind of a pass is that? Artyom was curious. So, the award booklet for the medal for service to the fatherland. Ullman laughed it off. Everyone is indebted to our colonel. The crossing to the ring was a strange mixture of fortress and warehouses. The second Hansa border began beyond the footbridges over the tracks. Real redoubts had been erected there with machine guns and even a flamethrower. And further away, next to a memorial, a bronze bearded guy with a machine gun, a frail girl and a pensive lad with weapons, most likely the founders of Byeloruskaya or heroes of a battle with mutants, Artyom thought. A whole garrison of not less than 20 soldiers was deployed. This is because of the Reich, Ullman explained to Artyom. It's like this with the fascists. Trust but verify. They didn't touch Switzerland, of course, but they subjugated France. I have gaps in my knowledge of history, Artyom acknowledged with embarrassment. My stepfather couldn't find a 10th grade textbook. Though I have read a little about ancient Greece. An endless chain of loaders with bundles on their shoulders trailed past the soldiers like ants. The movement was well organized. The bearers descended on one escalator, and they came up, unladen, on the other. A third was intended for the remaining passers-by. Below sat a machine gunner in a glass booth, watching the escalator. He checked Artyom and Ullman's documents again and issued them papers with the stamp, temporary registration, in transit, and the date. This station also was named Byeloruskaya, but the difference from its radial twin was striking. They were like twins separated at birth, one of whom ended up in a royal family and the other who was adopted and grew up poor. All the prosperity of that first Bieloruskaya faded in comparison with the ring station. It gleamed with shining white walls, fascinated with intricate stucco work on the ceiling and dazzled with neon lamps, of which only 3 were burning in all the station. But even their light was more than enough. The loaders on the platform were divided into 2 parts. One group walked to the tracks through arches on the left, the other to the right, casting off their bundles into piles and returning at a run for new ones. 2 stops had been made at the tracks, for merchandise, where a small crane had been installed, and for passengers, where a ticket office stood. Once every 15 or 20 minutes, a cargo handcar went past the station. They were outfitted with a peculiar body, board planking on which they had loaded boxes and bundles. Besides the 3 or 4 men who stood at the handles of the handcar, there also was a guard on each. The passenger handcars arrived more rarely. Artyom and Ulman had to wait more than 40 minutes. As the ticket collector explained to them, the passenger handcars waited until enough people had gathered so as not to send the workers on errands for no reason. The fact that somewhere in the metro it was still possible to buy a ticket, a cartridge for each stage, and pass from station to station as before, completely fascinated Artyom. He even forgot about all his problems for a while and simply stood and observed the loading of the merchandise. It showed him how fine life in the metro must have been earlier, when huge sparkling trains, not manual handcars, moved along the tracks. "That's your carrier coming," the ticket collector announced, and he began to ring a small bell. A large handcar, to which was attached a tram with wooden benches, rolled to a stop. Having presented their tickets, they sat down on unoccupied seats. After waiting another few minutes for tardy passengers, the trolley moved on. Half the benches were situated so that the passengers were sitting facing forward and half facing to the rear. Artyom had got a seat facing backwards, and Ulman was sitting in the remaining seat with his back to him. "Why are the seats arranged so strangely in different directions?" Artyom asked of his neighbor, a hale old woman of about 60 years old, who was wearing a woolen shawl riddled with holes. "It's uncomfortable, you know." She threw up her hands. "And what? Would you leave the tunnel running wild? You young people are thoughtless? Didn't you hear what happened over there the other day?" "Well, such a rat," the old woman gestured in dismay, "jumped out of an interline and dragged away a passenger." "It wasn't a rat," a man in a quilted jacket interrupted, turning round. "It was a mutant. They have a lot of mutants running about at Kurskaya. And I say, a rat. Nina Prokoyevna, my neighbor, told me. Do you think I don't know?" The old woman was indignant. They argued for a long time, but Artyom was no longer listening to their conversation. His thoughts, once again, had turned to VDNKh. He had already decided that before he went up to the surface to set out for the Ostankino Tower with Ulman, he would definitely try to get through to his home station. He still didn't know how he would convince his partner, but he had a bad feeling that this might be his last chance to see his home and friends, and he couldn't ignore it. Who knew what would happen later? Though the stalker had said that there was nothing complicated about their task, Artyom didn't really believe that he would be meeting him any time again. However, before starting his own, perhaps, final climb up, he had to at least return to VDNKh for a little while. How it sounded. VDNKh. Melodic, endearing. I could listen and listen to it, Artyom thought. Had his casual acquaintance at Bieloruskaya really been speaking the truth? Was the station really on the point of falling to the onslaught of the Dark Ones? Were half its defenders already dead? How long had he been absent? 2 weeks? 3? He closed his eyes, trying to imagine his beloved arches, the elegant but reserved lines of the domes, the delicate forging of the copper ventilation grids between them and rows of tents in the hall. The handcar gently swayed in time to the lulling chatter of the wheels, and Artyom didn't notice that it was putting him to sleep. He was dreaming about VDNKh again. Nothing surprised him anymore. He wasn't listening and not trying to understand. The goal of his dream was not at the station, but in the tunnel. Leaving the tent, Artyom went right to the tracks, jumped down and headed south towards the botanical gardens. The darkness no longer frightened him, but something else did. The forthcoming meeting in the tunnel. Who awaited him there? What was the point of it? Why did his courage always fail him in the end? His twin finally appeared in the depths of the tunnel. Soft, confident steps gradually approached as before, and Artyom felt his nerve failing. However, this time he comported himself better. His knees shook, but he was able to control himself and wait until he came right up to the unseen creature. He was covered in a cold, sticky sweat, but did not break into a run when the light ripple of the air told him that the mysterious being was just a few centimeters from his face. "Don't run. Look into the eyes of your fate," a dry, rustling voice whispered into his ear. And here Artyom recalled, and just how had he been able to forget about it in his past nightmares, that he had a lighter in his pocket. Groping for it, he struck the flint, preparing to see who was speaking to him, and he immediately went numb, feeling only that his feet were taking root in the ground. A dark one stood next to him, not moving. Its dark eyes were without pupils and wide open, searching for his glance. Artyom cried as loudly as he could, "Damnation!" The old woman was holding her hand to her heart, breathing heavily. "How you frightened me, you tyrant! Please forgive him. He's with me and he's nervous," Ullman said, turning around. "Just what did you see there that you shouted out?" The old woman shot him a curious glance from beneath half-closed, swollen eyelids. "It was a dream. I had a nightmare," Artyom answered. "Excuse me." "A dream? Well, you young people are impressionable." She again started moaning and bickering. Actually, Artyom had slept for a rather long time. He even had slept through the stop at Novoslobodskaya, but he didn't have time to remember what he had understood at the end of his nightmare as the passenger handcar arrived at Prospect Mir. The situation here was strikingly different from the satisfying prosperity of Bieloruskaya. There was no business recovery at Prospect Mir, not even a sign of it. But on the other hand, one immediately noticed a large number of military personnel, Spetsnaz and officers with the chevrons of the engineering troops. From the other edge of the platform on the tracks stood several guarded cargo motorized trolleys with mysterious boxes covered with tarpaulins. In the hall, nearly 50 poorly dressed people with huge trunks were sitting right on the floor, looking round hopelessly. "What's going on here?" Artyom asked Ullman. "It's not what's happening here. It's what you have going on at VDNKh," the fighter replied. "It's obvious they intend to blow up the tunnels. If the Dark Ones crawl through from Prospect Mir, Hansa will have to answer for it. Most likely they are getting ready for a preemptive strike." While they were crossing to the Kalushka-Rizhskaya line, Artyom grew convinced that Ullman's guess was most likely correct. The Hansa Spetsnaz was also active at a radial station where it wasn't supposed to be. Both entrances to the tunnels leading to the north, towards VDNKh and the botanical gardens, were fenced off. Someone had constructed some makeshift blockhouses here, where the Hansa border guards were on duty. There were no visitors in the marketplace. Almost half the stands were empty, and people whispered nervously, as if inevitable misfortune was looming over the station. Several dozen people were crowded into one corner, whole families with bundles and bags. A chain had been strung around a table with the sign, "Refugee Registration." "Wait for me here. I'll go find our man." Ullman left him at the shopping area and disappeared. But Artyom had a few things he wanted to do himself. Climbing down onto the rails, he went up to a blockhouse and started talking with a sullen border guard. "Can one still get to VDNKh?" "We are still letting them through, but I don't advise going there," the guard answered. "Haven't you heard what's happening there? Some kind of vampires are getting in, so many that they can't be stopped. They've taken over nearly the whole station. Obviously, it's really hot there. If our miserly leadership had decided to let them have some free ammo, if only to hold them off till tomorrow." "What's happening tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we're going to blow everything to hell. We are placing dynamite 300 meters from Prospect in both tunnels, and everything will be just a fond memory." "But why don't you just help them? Certainly Hansa has the power. I told you, there are vampires there. It's swarming with them. There's not enough backup." "But what about the people from Rizhskaya and from VDNKh itself?" Artyom couldn't believe his ears. "We alerted them several days ago. They are trickling in. Hansa is taking them. We aren't animals, but they had better hurry. When the time runs out, it's so long. So you should try to get there and back as soon as possible. What do you have there? Business? Family?" "All of it," Artyom replied, and the border guard nodded knowingly. Ullman was standing in the arch, quietly speaking with a tall young man and a stern man in a machinist's coat, and with the full regalia of the station chief. The vehicle is up above and the tank is full. In any event, I still have a radio and protective suits, and another Pecheneg and a Dragunov sniper rifle. The youth pointed at 2 large black bags. We can go up at any time. When do you need us up there? We'll be monitoring the signal every 8 hours. We should already be in position by then, Ullman answered. Is the pressurized gate working? He addressed the chief. It's okay, the chief confirmed. When you give the word, only we'll have to drive off the people so they aren't frightened. That's all I have. So we'll rest for about 5 hours or so and then full speed ahead, Ullman summed up. So, Artyom, lights out? I can eat, Artyom told him, pulling his partner aside. I have to get back to VDNKh to say goodbye and just to look around. You were right. They will be blowing up all the tunnels from Prospect Mir. Even if we come back alive from there, I won't see my station anymore. I have to. Honestly. Listen, if you're just afraid of going up to your Dark Ones, just say so, Ullman nearly started. But on seeing Artyom's look, he stopped short. It was a joke. Excuse me. Honest, I have to, Artyom repeated. He couldn't explain his feeling, but he knew that he had to get to VDNKh at any cost. Well, if you have to, then you have to, the fighter replied, embarrassed. You won't have time to get back, especially if you intend to say goodbye to someone there. Here's what we'll do. We'll ride from here along Prospect Mir in the vehicle with Pashka. That's him with the cases. We had intended to go directly to the tower earlier, but we can take a detour and run by the old entrance to the VDNKh metro. Everything new has been turned upside down. Your people have to know that. We'll wait for you there, in 5 hours and 50 minutes. Whoever doesn't make it is late. Did you get a suit? Do you have a watch? Here, take mine. I'll get one from Pashka. He unfastened the metal bracelet. In 5 hours, 50 minutes. Artyom nodded, shook Ullman's hand, and raced towards the blockhouse. Seeing him again, the border guard shook his head. And nothing else strange is happening in this crossing? Artyom asked. Are you here about the pipes or what? It's nothing. They patched them up. They say your head will spin when you are going by, the border guard answered. Artyom thanked him with a nod, turned on his flashlight, and walked into the tunnel. Different thoughts raced through his head for the first 10 minutes. About the danger of the crossing laying ahead, about the considered and reasonable way of life at Bieloruske, then about the carriers and real trains. But gradually the tunnel's darkness sucked these trivial thoughts, this confusion of flashing pictures and snatches of phrases from him. At first he grew calm, empty. Then he began to think about something else. His journey was coming to an end. Even Artyom could not say how long he had been away. Maybe 2 weeks had passed, perhaps more than a month. How simple, how short the trip had seemed to him when, sitting on the handcar at Alexeyevskaya, he had been looking at his old map in the light of the flashlight, trying to plan a route to Polis. An unknown world lay before him then, about which he knew nothing for certain. It had been possible to develop a route by considering only the length of the journey and not how it would change the traveler walking it. Life had turned out to be very different, confused and complex, mortally dangerous. Even casual companions, sharing small segments of his trip with him, had paid for it with their lives. Artyom remembered Oleg. Everyone has his own predestination, Sergei Andreevich had told him at Polyanka. Could it have been that the terrible, nonsensical death spared other people and allowed them to continue their affairs? Artyom grew cold and uncomfortable. To accept such a proposition, to accept this sacrifice, meant that he had to believe that his journey could only be at the cost of somebody's life. Could it be that in order to fulfill his predestined fate, others had to be trampled, destroyed, crippled? Oleg, of course, had been too young to ask why he had been born. But if he had thought about it, he would hardly have agreed to a fate. The faces of Mikhail Porfiryevich, Daniel, and Tretyak passed before his eyes. Why did they die? Why did Artyom himself survive? What gave him this capacity, this right? Artyom was sorry that Ullman, who with one mocking remark could dispel his doubts, was not with him now. The difference between them was that the trip through the metro had forced Artyom to see the world as if through a multifaceted prism, but Ullman's Spartan life had taught him to view things simply, through the sight of a sniper's rifle. He didn't know which of the two of them was right, but Artyom no longer was able to believe that there can be only one single true answer to every question. Generally in life, and especially in the metro, everything was unclear, changing, and relative. Khan had explained this to him at first using the example of the station clock. If such a basis for perceiving the world as time turned out to be far-fetched and relative, then just what could be said about other indisputable views of life? All of it, from the voice of the pipe in the tunnel through which he was walking, and the shining of the Kremlin stars to the eternal secrets of the human soul, had several explanations. And there were many answers to the question, why? The people Artyom had encountered, from the cannibals at Park Pobedi to the fighters of the Che Guevara Brigade, knew how to answer it. All of them had their own answers. The sectarians and the Satanists, the fascists and the philosophers with the machine guns, like Khan. It was for this reason that it was difficult for Artyom to choose and accept only one of them. Getting a new version of the answer every day, Artyom was unable to compel himself to believe what was true, because the next day another, no less precise and comprehensive one might arise. Whom should he believe? And in what? In the great worm, the cannibalistic god, shaped like an electrified train and populating the barren, scorched earth with living beings, in the wrathful and jealous Jehovah, in his vainglorious reflection, Satan, in the victory of communism in the whole metro, in the supremacy of the fair-haired men with turned-up noses over curly-haired, swarthy races. Something suggested to Artyom that there were no differences in any of it. Any faith served man only as a crutch supporting him. When Artyom was young, his stepfather's story about how a monkey took up a cane and became a man made him laugh. After that, apparently, the clever macaque no longer let the cane out of his hand because he couldn't straighten up. He understood why man needs this support. Without it, life would have become empty, like an abandoned tunnel. The desperate cry of the savage from Park Pobedi when he realized that the great worm was only a contrivance of his people, his priests still resonated in Artyom's ears. Artyom felt something similar, finding out that the unseen observers did not exist. But for him, repudiation of the observers, the snake and other metro gods made life easier. Did that mean that he was stronger than the others? Artyom understood that was not true. The cane was in his hands, and he was supposed to become brave enough to recognize it. His awareness that he was carrying out an assignment of huge importance, that the survival of the whole metro was in his hands, and that this mission hadn't been entrusted to him by chance, served as his support. Consciously or not, Artyom looked for proof in everything that he had chosen for carrying out this mission, but not like Hunter, but someone or something greater. To destroy the Dark Ones, to save his home station and those near and dear from them, and to stop the destruction of the metro, that was his task. And everything that had happened to Artyom during his travels proved only one thing. He was not the same as everyone. Something special had been intended for him. He was supposed to make mincemeat of and destroy the vermin, which otherwise would make short work of the remnants of mankind. While he was walking along this path, faithfully interpreting the signs being sent his way, his will for success was overcoming reality, playing with statistical probability, warding off bullets, blinding monsters and enemies, and compelling allies to be at the right location at the right time. How else could he understand why Daniel had turned over to him the plan of the missile unit's location, and this unit by some miracle had not been destroyed decades ago? How else to explain that, against all common sense, he had met one of the few, maybe only living, missile men in the whole metro? Had Providence placed powerful weapons into Artyom's hands personally and sent him a man to help deliver a death blow to the inexplicable and merciless force, crushing it? How else could all the miraculous rescues of Artyom from the most desperate situations be explained? While he believed in his own predestination, he was invulnerable, although people who accompanied him perished one after the other. Artyom's thoughts turned to what had been said by Sergei Andreevich at Polyanka about fate. At that time, those words had driven him forward, like a new lubricated spring installed in the worn-out, corroded mechanism of a wind-up toy. But at the same time, they were unpleasant for him. Maybe it was because this theory deprived Artyom of his own free will and forced him to submit to the storyline of his own fate. But on the other hand, how was it possible for him to refute the existence of this line of thinking after everything that had happened to him? He could no longer believe that his whole life was only a succession of random events. Too much already had happened, and it was impossible to get out of this rut just like that. If he had gone so far, then he had to go even further. Such was the inexorable logic of the path chosen. Now it was already too late to hold any doubts. He must go forward, even if this meant bearing the responsibility not only for his own life, but also for the lives of others. All the sacrifices had not been in vain. He had to accept them. He was obligated to take his path to the end. That was his fate. Just how had he lacked this clarity earlier? He had doubted his own election, distracted by stupidity and hesitating all this time. But the answer always was right there. Ullman had been right. There's no need to complicate life. Artyom was walking now, briskly beating out the pace, and he hadn't heard any noise from the pipes. Nothing dangerous had been encountered at all in the tunnels all the way to VDNKh. However, Artyom had come across people who were going to Prospect Mir. He was moving against the flow of those unfortunates who were exhausted, had cast off everything, and were running from the danger. They viewed him as a madman. He alone was walking into the lair of terror itself. At the same time, the others were trying to abandon the cursed place. There were no patrols at Rizhskaya or at Alexeyevskaya. Immersing himself in his thoughts, Artyom didn't notice when he had approached VDNKh, though not less than an hour and a half had passed. Climbing into the station and looking around, he unwillingly shuddered. How much it reminded him of that VDNKh he saw in his nightmares. Half the lighting was not working. There was the odor of burning gunpowder in the air, and somewhere in the distance were heard the moans and the anguished crying of women. Artyom held the machine gun at the ready and moved ahead, carefully skirting the arches and examining the shadows closely. It was as if the Dark Ones had been able, at least once, to penetrate the fences and reach the station itself. Some of the tents had been cleared away, and in several places there were dried traces of blood on the floor. People were still living here and there, and a flashlight sometimes even shone through the canvas. Distant gunfire could be heard from the northern tunnel. The exit to it was covered with bags of dirt piled as high as a man. 3 men were pressed against this breastwork, observing the tunnel through gun slots and keeping the approaches in their sights. "Artyom! Artyom! Where did you come from?" A familiar voice hailed him. Turning around, he noticed Kirill, one of the men he had left VDNKh with at the very beginning of his journey. Kirill's arm was in a sling, and the hair on his head seemed even more unkempt than usual. "Well, I've come back," Artyom answered vaguely. "How are you holding out here? Where's Uncle Sasha? Where's Jenka?" "Jenka, he was caught. They killed him a week ago," Kirill said gloomily. Artyom's heart fell. "And my stepfather? Sukhoi is alive and well. He's in charge. He's in the infirmary right now." Kirill waved a hand in the direction of the staircase leading to a new exit from the station. "Thanks." Artyom raced away. "And just where have you been?" Kirill cried after him. The infirmary was sinister. There weren't many real wounded here, only 5 men. Other patients occupied the majority of the space. Diapered like infants and confined in sleeping bags, they were laid out in a row. All of them had their eyes wide open, and they mumbled incoherently through their half-open mouths. It wasn't a nurse watching over them, but a rifleman holding a file with chloroform in his hands. From time to time, one of those in diapers began to fidget along the floor, howling and transferring his agitation to the rest, and then the guard would place a rag soaked with chloroform to the man's face. The man didn't fall asleep, nor did he close his eyes, but he went quiet for some time and calmed down. Artyom didn't see Sukhoi right away. He was sitting in the office discussing something with the station doctor. Leaving, he ran into Artyom and was stupefied. "You're alive. Artyomka, alive. Thank God." "Artyom," he had begun to mutter, touching Artyom on the shoulder, as if wishing to convince himself that Artyom was indeed standing in front of him. Artyom embraced him, and he, like a child, was afraid in the depths of his soul that he would return to the station, and his stepfather would begin to scold him. He would say, "Where did you disappear to? How irresponsible! How long were you going to behave like a little boy?" But instead, Sukhoi just held him close and didn't let go for a long time. When the fatherly embrace finally ended, Artyom saw that Sukhoi's eyes were filled with tears, and he blushed. Briefly, he told his stepfather where he had disappeared to and what he had managed to do during that time, and he explained why he had returned. Sukhoi only shook his head and criticized Hunter. Then he came to his senses, saying that he would not speak ill of the dead. Though he didn't know what had happened to Hunter. "Do you see what's going on here?" Sukhoi's voice again hardened. "Every night they pour in, and there aren't enough bullets. A handcar arrived from Prospect Mir with supplies, but it's peanuts. They want to blow up the tunnel at Prospect Mir to cut off both VDNKh and the other stations completely," Artyom reported. "Yes, they are afraid of the groundwater. They aren't venturing close to VDNKh, but this won't help for long. The Dark Ones will find other entrances. When will you be leaving here? There's only a little time left. Less than a day. You have to get everything ready." His stepfather took a long look at him as if checking him over. "No, Artyom, I only have one way out of here, and it's not to Prospect Mir. We have 30 wounded men here. What are we to do with them? Throw them away? And who will maintain the defenses while I am saving my hide? How can I go up to a man and say to him, 'Well, you are staying here so that you can hold them off and die, but I'm going—'" "No," he took a breath. "Let them blow it up. We'll hold out as long as we can. I have to die like a man." "Then I'll stay with you," Artyom said. "They have the missiles, and they will manage without me. What's my purpose anyway? At least I'll help you." No, you must go," Sukhoi interrupted him. "We have a fully operational pressurized gate, and the escalator is working again. You can make your way to the exit quickly. You must go with the others. They don't even know what they're dealing with." Artyom suspected that his stepfather was sending him away from the station just to save his life. He tried to object, but Sukhoi didn't want to hear anything. "Only you alone in your group know how the Dark Ones are able to drive people mad." He pointed at the diapered wounded. "What's wrong with them? They were in the tunnels. They couldn't hold out. We managed to drag these out, and that's good. But the Dark Ones tore so many apart while they were alive. Incredible strength. The main thing is, when they approach and begin to howl, there are few who can stand it. You understand that? Our volunteers handcuffed themselves together so they wouldn't run away. But those who managed to get loose are lying here. There are only a few wounded because if the Dark Ones reach you, it's hard to get away." "Zhenka? Did they get him?" Artyom asked, swallowing. Sukhoi nodded. Artyom decided not to get the details. "Let's go while there's a lull." Taking advantage of his silence, Sukhoi added, "We'll have a chat and drink some tea. We still have some left. Are you hungry?" His stepfather embraced him and moved into the command room. Artyom looked around in amazement. He could not believe that in the weeks since he had left that VDNKh had managed to change so much. The once comfortable, home-like station had now been cast into anguish and despair. He wanted to flee from here as soon as possible. A machine gun clattered behind them. Artyom gripped his weapon. "That's a warning," Sukhoi said. "The most terrible time will start in a few hours. I feel it already. The Dark Ones come in waves, and we have killed only one recently. Never fear. If something serious begins, our guys will use the siren. They sound a general alarm." Artyom pondered. His dream of walking into the tunnel, now it was impossible, and a real meeting with a Dark One would hardly end just as harmlessly. There was no point in mentioning it when Sukhoi would never allow him to go into the tunnel alone. He had to reject such a mad idea. He had more important things to do. "I knew that you and I would see each other again, that you would come," Sukhoi said, pouring the tea once they were in the command room. "A man arrived here a week ago looking for you." "What man?" Artyom was put on his guard. "He said you and he are acquainted. Tall, skinny, with a small beard. He had a strange name similar to Hunter's. Khan." Artyom was surprised. "That's it. He told me that you would come back here again and was so certain that I was put at ease at once. And he also gave me something for you." Sukhoi reached for the wallet in which he kept notes and objects known only to him and pulled out a sheet of paper folded a couple of times. Unfolding the paper, Artyom lifted it to his eyes. It was a short note. The words written in a sloppy, fleeting hand baffled him. He who is brave and patient enough to peer into the darkness, his whole life will be first to see a flicker of light in it. And didn't he give you anything else? Artyom asked with a puzzled look. No, replied Sukhoi. I thought it was a coded message. But the man had come here especially for this. Artyom shrugged his shoulders. Half of everything Khan had said and done seemed complete nonsense to him, but on the other hand, the other half had compelled him to look at the world otherwise. How was he to know to which part this note pertained? They drank tea and chatted for quite a while. Artyom was unable to throw off the feeling that he was seeing his stepfather for the last time, and it was as if he was trying to talk long enough with him to last him for the rest of his life. Then the time to leave arrived. Sukhoi tugged the handle, and with a grinding sound, the heavy cover lifted a meter. Stagnant rainwater poured down from outside. Standing in slime up to his ankles, Artyom smiled at Sukhoi, though the tears were welling up in his eyes. He was on the point of saying goodbye when, at the last moment, he remembered the most important thing. Withdrawing the children's book from his rucksack, he opened it to the page with the photograph inside and handed it to his stepfather. His heart began to beat anxiously. What is it? Sukhoi was surprised. Do you recognize her? Artyom asked hopefully. Look closer. Isn't this my mother? You would have seen her when she gave me away to you. Artyom, Sukhoi smiled sadly. I hardly saw her face. It was very dark there, and I was looking at a rat. I don't remember her at all. I remember how you then grabbed my hand and didn't cry at all. And then she was gone. I'm sorry. Thank you. Bye. Artyom was on the verge of saying, Daddy, but a lump got caught in his throat. Maybe we'll meet again. He tightened his gas mask, bent over, slipped beneath the curtain, and ran up along the rickety steps of the escalator, carefully pressing the crumpled photograph to his breast. The escalator seemed simply endless. One had to climb it slowly and very carefully. The steps creaked and chattered beneath his feet, and in one place they unexpectedly moved downwards, and Artyom barely managed to yank away his foot. Moss-covered remnants of huge branches and small saplings were scattered everywhere, carried here by the explosion, perhaps. The walls were overgrown with bindweed and moss, and through holes in the plastic covering of the side barriers, the rusty parts of the mechanism could be seen. He did not once glance back. Everything was black up above. That was a bad sign. Suddenly he thought, what if the station pavilion crumbled and he couldn't overcome the obstacle? If it were just a moonless night, it wouldn't be too bad, but it wouldn't be easy guiding the fire of the missile battery in poor visibility. The closer to the end of the escalator, the brighter the glares on the walls and the thin beams penetrating the slits became. The exit to the exterior pavilion was blocked, not by stones, but by fallen trees. After several minutes of searching, Artyom discovered a narrow trapdoor through which he could just about squeeze. A huge gap, almost the length of the whole ceiling, yawned in the roof of the vestibule through which the pale lunar light fell. The floor was covered with broken branches and even with whole trees. Artyom noted several strange objects next to one of the walls, large dark gray leather spheres as tall as a man rolling in the brush. They looked repulsive, and Artyom was afraid to go any closer to them. Switching off his flashlight, he exited onto the street. The upper station vestibule stood among an accumulation of the expanded frames of once graceful merchants' pavilions and kiosks. Ahead he could see an enormous building. It was strangely bent, and one of the wings was half demolished. Artyom looked around. Ulman and his comrade were not around. They must have been delayed along the way. He had a little time left to study the surroundings.